The last Russian troops left Estonia and Latvia at the end of August. The last vestiges of the Soviet presence in Eastern Europe thus ended, and a few days later Russia and China agreed to de-target the nuclear weapons they had aimed at each other. As with the equivalent agreement between Russia and the US, it was largely symbolic, but welcome nonetheless. President Clinton signed into law the Public Safety and Recreational Firearms Use Protection Act, more commonly known as the Federal Assault Weapons Ban. Demands for such a ban had been intensified following a school shooting in Stockton, California in 1989 and subsequent high-profile incidents. After much debate, the new act would ban the importing and sale of any new, quote, semi-automatic assault weapons, end quote, as defined by the act, though would not affect any that were already legally owned at the time it came into force. A variety of legal challenges to the ban, though none under the Second Amendment, interestingly, were rejected, but in order for the Act to pass at all, the assault weapons ban would expire after 10 years and need to be renewed. But despite repeated attempts over the years, most notably in the wake of the Sandy Hook incident in 2012, the ban has never been renewed or reinstated. And with such a short period in force and the number of weapons already in existence, studies of whether or not it actually made any difference to the rates of gun violence during its operation have remained inconclusive. And the North Yorkshire coastal town of Whitby hosted the first annual Goth weekend, the brainchild of Joe Hampshire and a group of about 40 pen pals. Whitby was chosen as the venue, partly as it was reasonably local to Yorkshirewoman Joe, but also because Bram Stoker's novel Dracula was both written and partially set in the town, so if nothing else the locals were used to this kind of thing. Beginning as a small event, the festival quickly ballooned and diversified, moved to a twice-yearly slot, and attracted goths and other associated subcultures from around the world, and indeed a steampunk festival was spun off from 2017 onwards. There were spectres of a different kind hanging over the Benetton team as they headed to Paris for a series of FIA meetings to rule on the numerous controversies hanging over the team. First up was the hearing of the team's appeal against Michael Schumacher's 2-race suspension after ignoring a black flag at Silverstone. Rather than focus on the unclear messaging from the circuit stewards, Schumacher insisted that he not only hadn't seen the black flag, but hadn't understood why a board with his number on was being shown. The 4 judges of the tribunal were unimpressed and upheld the ban, so Schumacher would now miss the Italian and Portuguese Grand Prix. He left protesting his innocence, naturally. A week later, Flavio Briatore was in Paris to talk about the fire at Hockenheim and the skid block in Belgium. The latter was dealt with first as it was a more straightforward issue. Ross Brawn and Juan Villadel-Prat argued firstly that Schumacher had suffered a technical problem at his first pit stop, and secondly that his spin on lap 19 had added to the damage. They also noted that Verstappen's car showed no abnormal wear on the plank, which supported their case that there was a specific technical problem with Schumacher's car. Again, though, the Federation wasn't having it, producing photos showing the marks from the spin at the rear of the plank, while the excessive wear in question was at the front, with evidence of the wear going front to back rather than sideways or in a circle as one might expect from a spin. When Brawn and Villadel-Prat were unable, or perhaps unwilling, to detail what exact technical problem Schumacher's car had suffered in that pit stop that might lead to the wear, the disqualification was upheld. The matter of the pit fire was more tricky given the safety implications and the number of different actors involved. The cause of the fire was the absence of a fuel filter which allowed some foreign object to get into the nozzle and prevent it seating properly. That much was uncontroversial at least. Pretty much everything else was hotly disputed. Flavio Briatore maintained that other teams had also removed the filter, and that he'd received permission from Charlie Whiting to do so. The FIA countered that only the fuel rig manufacturers Autotechnique could give that permission, and only in writing. Benetton then fell back on 3 arguments. Firstly, that they had never tried to conceal the fact that they'd removed the filter and had even talked to Charlie Whiting about it, which Whiting confirmed. Secondly, if the filter had been removed without permission, it could easily have been done by a junior employee acting on his own initiative. And thirdly, that Autotechnique could have given another team permission to remove the filters, even though they denied it. That last point was supported by Gerard Larousse, who, a few days before the hearing, suddenly remembered that he'd had a fax from Autotechnique back in May telling him how to remove the filter, complete with technical drawings, which he'd duly produced. There was no indication that the Larousse team, who coincidentally used Benetton's gearbox, had removed the filters themselves, but it was enough to muddy the waters. In the end, Bernie Eccleston and Max Mosley, so often at loggerheads recently, came to the conclusion that all dragging this out any longer was doing was harming the sport, and chucking Benetton out of the championship altogether would be just a scandal too far, not to mention handing the title to Hill and Williams with a third of the season yet to go, which wasn't exactly going to help the viewing figures. So, as ever, a deal was done. The FIA acknowledged that Benetton had no intention of violating the regulations and dropped the charges. In exchange, Benetton were to make substantial management changes, though exactly what shape they would take remained unclear at this stage. Finally, a line was drawn under the affair of the engine software, which had initially involved three teams, Ferrari, Benetton and McLaren, whose engine software had been sequestered for analysis after Imola. The prancing horse had been acquitted pretty much straight away. Benetton's software looked distinctly fishy, but it couldn't be proved it had ever been used, which left Ron Dennis. He, like Benetton, had tried to stop the investigators reading the software on the grounds of industrial secrecy, but at the end of August, the investigators had reported that the McLaren were using a gearbox with a fully automated upshift, which was in violation of the rules. Dennis's defence was that his team had simply misinterpreted the rules, believing that a fully automatic gearbox controlled by a semi-automatic system was within the rules. Again, rather than drag things out in interminable legal proceedings or kick out another major team, Mosley publicly accepted Ron's explanation and acquitted McLaren on the proviso that they deactivated the upshift system in time for Monza. Then a memo went out to all the teams that from the Italian Grand Prix onwards, any software with suspicious characteristics would incur a prosecution even if deactivated. And with that, everyone fervently hoped all the controversies of 1994 could be put to bed and everyone could just get on with the sport. Nobody in the paddock was happier about all this, probably, than Damon Hill, now 21 points behind Schumacher. If he won both the next two races in Michael's absence, there would be just 1 point in it. But Hill wasn't entirely happy with the way things were going in his own garage. Still believing that Frank and Patrick didn't really rate him as a number one driver, he now complained that the team's chief engineer David Brown was assigned to car number 2, formerly Senna's car of course, but now Coulthard's, and threatened to take his complaints to the press until they gave in, the drivers swapping their engineering teams with Brown and Denis Chevrier now looking after Hill, and Jim Russell and Eric Ferrand servicing the Scott. But only for the next couple of races, because with the end of the 1994 IndyCar season, Nigel Mansell would be available for the last 3 races of the year. However, while the press had clamoured for Mansell's return earlier in the year, and given his misfortunes in the US it had been widely expected that he would return to Williams full-time for 1995, David Coulthard's performances in the meantime had led many, particularly in the specialist motorsport press, to suggest that actually Mansell had had his day and Williams should give Coulthard the drive. As the British press split themselves into Mansellites and Coulthardists, the young Scot had also had a tentative approach from Ron Dennis, who was interested in pairing him with Hakkinen if Williams didn't pan out. Elsewhere, the travails at the back end of the grid continued as Philippe Alliot's return to his old team proved short-lived. Instead, returning to Formula One after 4 years away with the team that gave him his debut was Yannick Dalmas, who'd arranged sponsorship from his home Provence-Alpes-Côte d'Azur region that ought to cover him for the rest of the season. Car number 19, Yannick Dalmas. Dalmas had made his debut in 1987, entering as second Larousse for the last 3 races of the season and finishing 5th in Australia, albeit ineligible for points. He joined the team full-time for 1988 and came close to scoring twice with 7th places in Monaco and Detroit, but his season was prematurely ended when he came down with Legionnaire's disease before the Japanese Grand Prix. He returned to the cockpit at the start of 1989, still with Larousse, but after he failed to qualify 5 times in the first 6 races, when teammate Alliot qualified every time, he was evidently still suffering the after-effects of the Legionella and was released. Undaunted, he signed up with AGS to replace Jo Winkelhock, but between his illness and the limitations of the car, he never made it out of pre-qualifying. Nonetheless, the team retained him for 1990, and he managed to qualify for just 5 races overall, being generally outshone by teammate Gabriele Tarquini. With no offers on the table for 1991, it looked like he might be done, but then a lifeline appeared, courtesy of Peugeot, who offered him a drive as they entered the World Sports Car Championship, pairing him with Keke Rosberg. It was a trying year, but things steadily improved with a win from pole at Magny-Cours, followed by another win in Mexico City. For 1992, though, the Peugeot was all-conquering, as the WSC struggled for entries with only 6 races on the calendar. Dalmas and his new co-driver Derek Warwick won 3 of them and came second twice, to win the title at a canter, with Mark Blundell joining the pair for one of those 3 wins at Le Mans. With the collapse of the WSC, 1993 was a bit quiet, though the Peugeot still entered Le Mans, Dalmas now with Thierry Boutsen and Theo Fabi, and coming second to the other Peugeot. In between times he entered French touring cars, which wasn't really his thing, and he came in unspectacular but solid 9th overall, and then in 1994 he returned to Le Mans, this time driving a Porsche-built Dauer 962 to his second win, this time shared with Mauro Baldi and Hurley Haywood. But with the future of sports car racing still uncertain, he evidently thought he might give F1 another shot now he'd definitely got the Legionnaire's disease out of his system. He wasn't expecting much from the struggling LaRousse team, but returning to the top table of motorsport was rewarding in itself. Over at Lotus, things were going from bad to worse, a major sponsor having sheepishly explained that it was nothing personal but they were out quite a lot of money, and Peters, Collins and Wright eventually had to file for bankruptcy, in the hole for a total of nearly £12 million. The courts would now be looking for a buyer for the team. One rumour suggested Honda might acquire at least part of it as a UK development base for Mugen. One of the few assets the team had that could quickly be realised, though, was Johnny Herbert's contract. The British driver was said to be coveted by both McLaren and Benetton, but for Italy at least he remained at Lotus, who have one great hope left, the new edition Mugen V10 engine, which has looked great in testing. Johnny would be reunited in Monza with Alessandro Zanardi, who the team wanted to give his home Grand Prix, as well as acknowledging he probably had a better shot at getting a good result than Philippe Adams, who would return in Portugal. Schumacher's absence meant that the Benettons would be driven by Leto and Verstappen, which would settle a couple of arguments, if nothing else. Tyrrell had a new Yamaha power plant, the K1, with another upgrade planned for Estoril, and Gianni Morbidelli had persuaded sponsor Oliveto to let him see out the season. Michael Schumacher was notably absent from Monza, electing not to come along for moral support, and indeed Paddock Rumour said he'd even refused to come to an upcoming test day, which meant that he missed Karl Wendlinger, who'd made the trip to Italy to visit the Sauber team and his good friend Gerhard Berger. He was presented to the crowd, who gave him a standing ovation, and after all the drama and tragedy so far this year, seeing him walking around waving and looking cheerful was something of a tonic, while his enthusiastic reception didn't do his own morale any harm either. During the race, he stopped by the Eurosport commentary booth to chat to Allard Kalf and John Watson, but I'm going to put the interview here.
We've got someone walking into our commentary booth, and I'm very happy to have you back. Karl Wendlinger, good to see you. What's it like being back at the Grand Prix?
Oh, it's very good, General, because it's a long time now since I had my accident, and of course I was thinking a lot about Formula One, and I was waiting a long time to come back again, but now Monza is the first time, and I'm very happy to be here.
How are you?
I'm very well. I have nearly no problem at all. I just have a little bit an hurting knee because I got an operation 10 days ago, and this I have to, how can I say, I have to bring up now slowly but surely, and this I do for the moment.
You're going back to Willy Dungal in Austria, or fitness clinic, and trying to get fit to get back into a Formula One car next year?
Yes, I mean, I'm sure that I can test already this year, that I'm able to test this year, because the main problem now I have is just the knee, and this just needs every day a therapy program for a few hours. But if this arrives on a certain level where I can start to make long distance training, then I think I'm quite soon able to drive these cars again.
Well, Karl Wendlinger, thank you very much for coming in with.
But of course the majority of the fans at the track weren't here to see Wendlinger or Johnny Herbert and Lotus or Yannick Dalmas or Hill or Schumacher or any of the other ones. They were here for the Ferraris. And for the first time in a good few years, the cars were running well. Berger had won from pole in Germany, admittedly with a little help from attrition. Alesi had had his first front row start in Canada, and the team had picked up 6 other podium positions so far. And the high-speed Monza circuit was ideally suited to their powerful V12 engines. For the first time since 1990, the Tifosi went through the gates at Monza with the real possibility of seeing a Ferrari win. The two red cars were both running different suspension setups. Jean had a Belleville system, and Gerhard had Koni and Penske dampers, but both chassis sported revised aerodynamics and wishbone attachments. It seemed to work. Friday saw Alesi fastest and Berger 4th, the pair sandwiching the Williamses of Hill and Coulthard, with Hakkinen 5th, and Johnny Herbert turning heads in 6th place, while Irvine's time was struck off after Eddie Jordan lost count when the drivers swapped cars, and Irvine did 1 lap too many. That and a gearbox problem for Pierluigi Martini put both Pacifics provisionally on the grid. Saturday came with great anticipation from the Tifosi, with everyone going quicker in the morning warm-up, which promised an entertaining qualifying battle. Paul Belmondo had a big off which demolished his car sufficiently that it wasn't going to be available for qualifying, so he'd have to sit that one out. Alesi went out early and beat his Friday's time, and before anyone could do better, he went out about halfway through and beat it again. The fans at the track went wild, which was nothing compared to the reaction when Berger went second, and as the hour went on, it became obvious that nobody else could match the Ferraris, and Jean Alesi took his first pole position at the 81st time of asking, with Berger alongside. Damon Hill was third, but only just, with Johnny Herbert an astonished and delighted fourth, his highest ever grid placing. Coulthard couldn't do better than fifth after a late engine failure and would line up alongside Olivier Panis, who spent most of Saturday's session having his car repaired after an early off, then put in a late banzai charge to have his best ever grid slot and Ligier's best of the year so far. The McLarens found their Peugeot V10s just lacked grunt for Monza, with Hakkinen 7th and Brundle all the way back in 15th. Frentzen had looked good in the warm-up, but it was De Cesaris who unexpectedly was top Sauber, with Irvine 9th and Jos Verstappen the best of the two Benettons in 10th place. He might actually have done better than that if Frentzen's onboard camera hadn't fallen off and got lodged in his side pod. Frentzen himself was 11th alongside Bernard, his best qualifying of the year too, with Zanardi 13th in the Lotus with the old engine, a qualifying position that would have been celebrated any other weekend but was rather overshadowed by Herbert's heroics. The Tyrrells were just unlucky, both drivers going off at the reprofiled second Lesmo and ending up 14th and 21st, bracketing the Arrowses and JJ Leto, who was really struggling in the Benetton, while the Larousses just wouldn't stay on the island, the rusty Dalmas having a scare when he broke his front suspension but still managed to go quicker than Comas. The Simtex lined up at the back as usual, David Brabham's good qualifying performances just no match for their aging Ford engine's lack of grunt. And business as usual for Pacific, where Belmondo's accident and an engine failure for Gasho left them floundering as usual. It was the first all-Ferrari front row at Monza since 1975, when the drivers in question were Niki Lauda and Clay Regazzoni. The Austrian was fighting McLaren's Emerson Fittipaldi for the title, and although Niki eventually finished third behind Regazzoni and Fittipaldi, it was enough to secure his second title. Alesi, for his part, beaming, said he was confident he could translate his first pole into his first win, and what a story that would be. Berger had a nasty off on Sunday morning, but after being taken over to the medical centre he was cleared to race, and was looking as cheerful as ever on the grid. Hills Williams suffered an oil leak on its way round to the grid, and he came back in to get the spare, with Juan Villadel-Prat ostentatiously looking at his watch as the pit lane closure time approached. Damon headed back out onto the grid with 90 seconds to spare, and the parade lap proceeded without incident. On came the green light, and away they went in a cloud of tyre smoke. Alesi and Berger stayed in formation, but Herbert got alongside Hill, challenging him for third. Irvine moved out to the right and had a great start, but locked his brakes up as they approached the first chicane and went right into the back of the Lotus, sending it spinning at the worst possible spot. The Jordan was beached too, but chaos reigned as Coulthard spun avoiding Herbert, Panis followed Irvine into the sand, and further back Comas cannoned into the back of De Cesaris as everyone hit the brakes, and several others stalled. Out came the red flags, and a restart would be taken. Alas for Herbert and Lotus though, the chassis was terminally bent, and he would have to take the restart in the spare Lotus with the older engine, with Irvine, Panis and De Cesaris also taking their T-cars. Irvine was demoted also to the back of the grid for the restart, pending further post-race investigation and sanctions. David Coulthard hopped in Damon's now repaired race car, but the spare Lotus couldn't be readied in time and Herbert would have to take the restart from the pit lane. He was understandably a bit miffed talking to the BBC.
No, that guy should be just banned from Formula One. He just makes such a bloody mess of everything.
25 minutes later they were ready to go again, and as they tore away from the grid, Eric Bernard stalled, but was missed by everyone else, while Alesi got a bit of wheel spin, allowing Hill to get up alongside, but Berger was able to fend him off as they went into the Rettifilio. This time they all got through okay, with a haze of tyre smoke produced by Panis avoiding a collision with Hakkinen and flat-spotting his tyres. As they went into Curva Grande, Morbidelli made a move on Zanardi, but the Lotus had picked up a puncture banging wheels with Verstappen and wobbled into the footwork, punting it off. Zanardi's puncture turned into a full-on blowout and he came in on three wheels to retire, as did Verstappen, who'd shed a big chunk of rubber on the run down to Parabolica. But Alesi and Berger came past the stands to finish lap 1 leading the race 1-2, and the fans couldn't care less what was happening to their compatriots Zanardi or Morbidelli. They had a scare when Berger went straight across the gravel trap at the Rettifilo, but he didn't seem to have damaged anything and didn't even lose second place, as Panis stopped to change his tyres and resumed. So it was a lazy leading Berger by 3 to 4 seconds, with the Austrian falling back into the clutches of Hill thanks to his excursion. And behind Hill were Coulthard, Häkkinen, Frentzen and Katayama, who'd got an absolute flyer and was now charging up the field, coming up from 14th to 7th in a couple of laps, with a bit of help from Eddie Irvine, of course. Berger had got back up to speed, but just couldn't quite get away from the Williamses queuing up behind him, who now had Katayama behind them as they came up to finish lap 4, having disposed of Frentzen and Häkkinen and left them behind already. Both Tyrrells, in fact, had started on light fuel loads for a 2-stop strategy with a long middle stint in the hopes of making up for their disappointing grid positions. Alesi continued pulling away from Berger at nearly a second a lap, with Hill, Coulthard, Katayama and Häkkinen making up the points places, followed by Frentzen and Barrichello, then a little gaggle of De Cesaris, Brundle, Leto and Blundell, who was charging like his teammate, soon passing the Benetton and the McLaren. Hill was still trying to pass Berger, but couldn't seem to find an opening through Gerhardt's robust defence, as Blundell proceeded past De Cesaris into 9th place, while further back Herbert had made his way up to 16th, with Irvine in tow. Blundell's efforts were all in vain, though, as he came in for his first fuel stop on lap 10, only for a problem getting his right rear wheel off to drop him right back to 21st. A lap later Katayama came in, and this time it was the left rear that caused the problem, dropping the diminutive Japanese down to 17th. Hill had dropped off Berger a little again, gathering himself for another go, but got very wide at the first chicane and nearly either collected Coulthard or let him through. In the end he did neither, but he did let Berger get away. By now, Alesi held a lead of over 11 seconds over his teammate, while Coulthard was nearly 10 seconds ahead of Häkkinen and Frentzen. Brundle overtook De Cesaris for 9th, and the Italian veteran now had a little queue behind him of Fittipaldi, Martini and Comas. Herbert had been on the tail of that group too, but he was betrayed by his alternator, and he pulled off, gutted. Alesi was in for his first stop at the end of lap 15, but when the mechanics dropped the car, first gear wouldn't engage, and he rolled forward away, engine screaming, before finally giving in and being pulled back to the garage. Mechanics swarmed all over the car trying to get it restarted again until cooler heads prevailed and pointed out that they'd be disqualified anyway for pulling him back, and a furious Jean threw his gloves away and stormed into the garage. So that left Berger in the lead, with the Williams twins right together a few seconds back. So far there had been 3 pit stops, each having a problem, and the trend continued as Leto came in. There was nothing wrong with the stop itself, but he would shortly find out that his rev limiter was out of adjustment, and he was called in for a stop-go penalty for speeding in the pit lane. Dalmas, running 16th, was having difficulty with his brake balance and spun off at the Rettifilo, putting an end to his comeback, just as Berger was approaching Eric Bernard to lap him, the French driver having got away very belatedly after being restarted in the pits. That was the point at which Karl Wendlinger stopped by the Eurosport booth, and no sooner had he left again than Andrea De Cesaris was pulling over with the smoking Mercedes, and then 2 laps later Frentzen's went up in sympathy, causing Barrichello to take evasive action. The Brazilian took 5th but didn't stay there for long, making his sole planned stop at the end of that lap, and then next time round it was Berger, in from the lead, locking everything up as he hit the limiter line. But just as he was done, Panis came into the pits in front of him and the team had to hold Gerhard and wait for him, while the French driver had difficulty getting into his pit box because of all the Ferrari mechanics standing around. All of which cost Berger vital seconds, as Hill put up the fastest lap and took the lead until his own stop next time round. A good one put Hill out ahead of Berger, with, just as in Belgium, Coulthard out in the lead briefly until his own stop, and just as in Belgium, David got out ahead of Damon, as Häkkinen briefly inherited the lead in turn. Once he'd stopped, Coulthard led Hill on lap 28 by just 0.7 seconds, with Berger 7 seconds behind him in third, then Häkkinen a fairly long way back, with Katayama, Fittipaldi, Barrichello and Blundell all within a few seconds of each other behind him. It was the first time that Coulthard had led a race properly, but after a radio message, he soon moved over to allow Hill through in pursuit of his title ambitions. As Alboreto pulled off from 15th with no gears, and Martini slipped on some oil dropped by Fittipaldi's sick engine and spun out next time round, Blundell had got past Barrichello, so both Tyrrells were in the points again despite their awful pit stops earlier, but they would need to stop at least once more. Katayama managed to outbrake Häkkinen into the second chicane to take 4th, and was now the fastest non-Williams on the track. With third-place Berger having real trouble lapping Leto, and just 14 seconds ahead of the Tyrrell, there was a potential podium place on the cards. Katayama and Leto stopped together on lap 34, dropping the Tyrrell back to 6th, while Hill and Coulthard were making their way through traffic, Hill just seeming a bit more hesitant than his young teammate, perhaps feeling the pressure to win in Schumacher's absence. Katayama had got back to charging, reeling in Barrichello and passing him on lap 39, and setting off in pursuit of Häkkinen once more. Further back, Blundell was 7th and lapping Panis, who'd just come out of the pits, who went off at the Ascari under pressure and lost a place to David Brabham. Olivier went straight back in to replace his gravel-studded new tyres, as his tormentor Blundell suffered a blown brake disc and bounced across the gravel, again at the Ascari, and out of the race. By now there were just 12 laps to go, with Hill leading Coulthard by a second and a half, with Berger 15 seconds behind and apparently powerless to do anything about it, but likewise pretty safe from Häkkinen, who had Katayama nibbling away at his lead. Irvine pulled in with a dead engine with 10 to go, and Fittipaldi's finally ran out of oil and let go in a big way on the start-finish straight. That left 12 cars running, which became 11 when Katayama suffered the exact same brake disc problem as his teammate and went thumping into the wall at the second Lesmo, and 10 when David Brabham put his foot on the brake and nothing happened. He managed to keep the Simtek under control and coast to a halt safely, having gone far enough to be classified 11th, which was where he'd been when he stopped. Berger was starting to catch the Williamses again as his fuel load came down, but it was far too late with only a couple of laps to go, and nothing could stop the first Williams 1-2 of the season. The first 1-2 for anyone of the season, indeed. Well, nothing except the fact that David Coulthard didn't have quite enough fuel, and as they came around the Parabolica for the last time, his engine spluttered to a halt, and Gerhard Berger swept gratefully through to take second to the full-throated roars of the crowd. Häkkinen was the similarly grateful recipient of third, with Barrichello 4th, Brundle 5th, and Coulthard having to make do as 6th, having lapped everyone from 7th place Bernard downwards. The remaining finishers Comas, Leto and Panis. Despite using Schumacher's car that had proved dominant so far, JJ Leto had found it just difficult to get to grips with the car and had all sorts of complaints about its handling, which seemed at least in part due to it having been built around a very different driving style to his own. But there was one bit of good news that evening for JJ, whose first child, a daughter, was born. His girlfriend had become pregnant just days before his colossal testing smash in January, and the thought of his unborn child never knowing its father must have been playing on his mind. The stewards gave Eddie Irvine another 3-race suspended ban, but both Johnny Herbert and Peter Collins understandably felt a stronger sanction was merited, Collins saying this brainless driver should have his licence revoked. Meanwhile, the usually mild-mannered Gianni Morbidelli had confronted Zanardi, who he accused of having taken him out, and punched him in the face. Clearly tempers were fraying around the paddock, particularly with those teams and drivers struggling for money. But mission completed for Damon Hill, who reduced the deficit to just 11 points, and the Tifosi still had cause to invade the track and celebrate Berger's second place, however fortuitous, and however much they must all have felt for a lazy. Lotus faced a long trip back empty-handed to plead for yet more patience from their creditors, in the hopes that the new engine could work its magic in Portugal, and Jean Alesi had already left the circuit, heading back to his home in Provence with his brother José, and unplugging his phone for the moment. It wasn't just the Ferrari fans, even the most flinty-hearted neutral really wanted to see Jean finally get that win on the board, just as nobody really wanted to see the historic Lotus name disappear, as was looking more and more likely. For some, it would be a long 2 weeks until Estoril, and for others, it couldn't come soon enough.